Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the world of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We'll also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we'll have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it in the group chat and we'll go through them in the order received. Today's host will be the Krulak Center's own Russia SME, Dr. Victoria Clement. And with that, Dr. Clement, over to you.
Thank you, sir. I'm happy to be with you all today, and I would like to introduce you to Dr. Richard Arnold, who's here to talk to us today about the rebirth of the Russian Cossacks out of the war in Ukraine. Just to give you a bit of Dr. Arnold's background, he's an associate professor of political science at Muskingum University. He's the author of Russian Nationalism and Ethnic Violence, Symbolic Violence, Lynching, Pogrom, and Massacre. And he also edited a book called Russia and the 2018 FIFA World Cup. His current interests are the connections between sport and politics, Cossack movements in Russia and Ukraine, far-right activity in Russia, and data science methods. And in spring 2022, Dr. Arnold won a Fulbright Award to teach and conduct research in Poland. And he spent the 2022-2023 academic year in Poland conducting research on Ukrainian Cossack formations and the importance of the Cossack archetype to Ukrainian national identity, as well as working with Ukrainian refugees and Polish institutions. This summer 2024, he will be a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. So we're so pleased to have him with us today. Dr. Arnold, welcome to the Brutecast. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give this podcast today. This is my title page slide, and I wanted to take the opportunity to tell you a little about these two pictures. The top picture is a famous painting by Ilya Repin, or actually it's a reproduction of a painting. The painting is called the Zaporozhian Cossacks Give a Reply to the Sultan, where the Sultan of Turkey made some demands of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who you're going to hear more about in a minute, and the Cossacks sent back this really foul, obscenity-laden letter, according to myth. So Repin made a painting of that. It's been updated to include Zelensky and some of the other leaders of the Ukrainian state. So as a kind of updating of the Zaporozhian Cossacks give a response to the new Tsar. The bottom picture is of the Russian Cossacks of a parade that they undertook, and you might ask what's the difference. Well, I'm going to be telling you about that. So let's begin with what is a Cossack. The Cossack is a historical archetype which is popular in both Ukraine and in Russia. The comparison is to the samurai. In Ukrainian history, the golden age of the Cossacks is really the 17th and 18th centuries, whereas in Russian history, the golden age of the Cossacks is the 19th century. Who were the Cossacks? Well, there are divided opinions on this. Some people think they were the descendants of slaves who ran away from the Crimean Khanate. That is to say, the Ottoman rulers of Crimea, who for a long time had a Khanate there, and they enslaved members of the local Slavic populations. Others will say that the Cossacks came from a mingling of Genghis Khan's Golden Horde with the indigenous Slavic populations on the Russian steppe. But what is definitely true is that by the 16th century, I think that should be 17th. Well, by the 16th century, they had established the Zaporozhian host. And Zaporozhia, I know Zaporozhia, the city, has been in the news recently. Zaporozhia, name means before the rapids or in front of the rapids, was really the birthplace of modern Cossackry at least if you believe the Ukrainians. And you see the map on the left there. You see the purple area is the lands claimed by the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who had their fortress or their sleeping quarters, if you will, on the island of Khortytsa, which is a river island in the Dnieper River in Zaporozhia. Well, the Zaporozhian Cossacks lived by selling their services to the Polish king, the Russian Tsar, and the Ottoman Sultan. They weren't really too worried about who they were selling to, but they fought as mercenaries. But by 1648, they'd created what was known as the Hetmanate, which was a proto-state structure in the lands of Ukraine. And actually, as you'll hear in a minute, the Ukrainians look at them as being their forebears. So by 1648, they established the Hetmanate under Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And for those of you who are familiar with Ukraine, you might have heard Khmelnytsky's name before. It's there's a big statue of Khmelnytsky in Kyiv. There's a town called Khmelnytsky, and so he's revered as being the founder of the Ukrainian state. In 1654, in order to seek protection from the Ottoman Sultan, the Cossacks signed the agreement, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, with the Russian Tsar, which is actually one of the issues right at the heart of the ideological contest that's going on today between Russia and Ukraine, whereby they accepted the suzerainty of the Tsar in exchange for providing permanent service and retaining some of the privileges they had some of the privileges they had before they submitted to the Tsar's suzerainty. The life of a Cossack was synonymous with freedom, and those of you who read Gogol or Pushkin, there's a lot of talk about freedom associated with the Cossacks and the wild horse riding culture. So they worked for the Russian state under license for about 120. In 1774, Catherine the Great, Catherine II, is the Zaporozhian siege and dispersed the Cossacks, and in fact removed them to the Kuban river frontier, which today we know as Krasnodar region. It's the region which borders Georgia, Abkhazia, excuse me. So there were two Cossack movements. One was centered around Zaporozhia, the other one was centered around the Don, and on the periphery, and later times, imitation movements were created, which were settled on the peripheries of the Russian Empire and fought for expansion of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, as frontier communities tend to do. So that's the prehistory. Why are they important today? Well, I'm going to look at both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, but taking the Russian side first, the Russians have been marked by the revival of a Cossack movement, which began in the 90s. There was a lot of talk about rebirth of the Cossacks, and that is where the title of this presentation comes from. But it's really taking place now. The Cossacks have contributed, the Russian Cossacks have contributed, according to their own websites, they've contributed 30,000, or roughly, I think it's 29,500 actually, so around 30,000 soldiers to the front. So we're rotating through the special military operation at this time. There's also, and that number has progressively increased since the date of the invasion in February 2022. There were signs as well that the Cossacks knew in advance about the forthcoming invasion of Ukraine. There are speeches given by Cossack leaders saying, once again, the Cossacks have to be prepared to be a sword and shield of Russia. There's also plans to create a Cossack reserve army in Russia. There are 60,000 Cossacks of fighting age, or registered Cossacks of fighting age, who have put forward, and their leader, Podlatsky, has put forward a bill to create a Cossack reserve army complete with its own artillery and guns. Finally, there's discussion of Russian Cossack private military companies as well. And one of the areas I'm interested in with future research is looking at the crossover between the PMCs about which we know already, such as Wagner and this new one, Convoy and Sword and Shield and some of the others, and the Russian Cossacks, because I'm imagining there's a lot of crossover between them. But there is definitely discussion of Russian Cossack private military companies. So that's Russia. Why are the Cossacks important for Ukraine? Well, the Ukrainians also hold the Cossack to be an extremely important image to their national identity. It is a source of inspiration for Ukrainian troops. I was in Ukraine in 2018 and 2019, and the Zaporozhian Cossacks have a particularly stylized haircut, which you can see in the picture on the right, as well as in the picture on the left. The picture on the right comes from the Euromaidan protests of 2014, where self-designated Cossacks rode on horseback in order to protect the rights of the people protesting. And that haircut, where you have a single lock of hair coming down over a shaved scalp, is known as the Oselerits, and it is a source of great inspiration for Ukrainian troops. As I mentioned with my travel to Ukraine in 2018-2019, I visited the barracks in Zaporozhye, and I saw lots of people with that haircut. It's an emergent national mascot. The Cossack has always been looked at, and if you look at Ukrainian national history textbooks, you know, they do make connections back to the Cossack past of Ukraine, looking at the Cossacks as being really the first Ukrainians. So it's an emergent national mascot, and particularly on the front lines in the current war, the imagery of the Cossack is used quite frequently. But there are signs also that the Ukrainian state has moved to harness the power on the inspiration of the Cossack image. On October 14th, 1999, they declared October 14th the Day of the Ukrainian Cossacks, which also coincided with a pre-existing holiday that was already established on October 14th called Pokrova, which is a religious festival for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox Church Ukrainian Patriarchate, and it was also the day of the founding of the UPA, the rebel army during World War II, which fought for Ukrainian independence. That meaning was built on when they declared the October 14th the Day of Defenders of Ukraine in 2014, and I'm in contact with Ukrainian Cossacks who really play up this image as being defenders and people who are ready to go to the front, and those people who played a big role in putting down the Novorossiya protests of 2014. In fact, building blockposti or checkpoints on the edge of cities. The badge on the left reads Ukraine or Death, and you can see the two stylized Cossack swords there and the stylized image of the Cossack head on that. So and again, there are other signs that the Ukrainian state has taken moves to institutionalize the Cossack identity, with the 54th Mechanized Infantry known as the Mazepa Battalion. Mazepa was a figure from Cossack history who actually rebelled against the Tsars after the Treaty of Pereyaslav. There are other signs with some military academies, for example, being named for Ivan Bohun, who was a Cossack military thinker, and a number of different Cossacks. Ivan Serko was another Cossack figure who was really important to Ukrainian national identity. And so naming battalions after these Cossack forebears really gives some additional sense of morale and inspiration to the people. So one of my research projects was interested in whether this could be considered as a battle over Cossack history. Could we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, in 2022. We were just talking that, of course, the war actually began in 2014. But could we look at this as being some kind of contestation over Cossack history? Who is the true heir of the Cossacks? And I think the significant evidence suggests that is at least part of the motivation that is driving Putin in this war. The picture is from this picture is from one of my papers showing the salience of the Cossack image in the Integrum database since 1997, when records begin, and you can see fairly even, beginning very highly in Russia, but coming down, and a fairly similar levels of interest and salience in Cossack history until 2020, when the salience of the Cossack image in the Ukrainian press goes off the charts. I'll also point out that in Putin's famous historical speech justifying or purporting to justify the invasion, he referred to the Zaporozhian Cossacks, I think, 5 times. And yes, while he also referred to other shared cultural legacies such as Kievan Rus, I would argue that the Cossacks are actually an even more immediate and impressive feature of the shared history, because they're not so old as to be chthonic, that is to say, they're not part of the ancient past. There are still modern reenactment movements, as you're going to hear shortly, and so they're much more visible to people. So this ideological contestation, the person on the left here is Viktor Vodolatsky, who is a former Cossack leader who has now moved into the Duma and is representing the Cossack cause in the State Duma in Russia. Vodolatsky's he's actually responsible for this passage of this bill to create a Cossack Reserve Army, and he's talking about, in a big interview he gave on the website kazachestvo.ru, he talked about the most important thing is that today the Nazi ideology will lose its foundation, which it trumpets. The Cossacks are our history, our meaning Russian history. The anthem of Ukraine is based on the Zaporozhye Cossacks. If today we knock out this ideological crutch, then the entire system of Ukraine is simply destroyed. So making a very forceful case that this war is, at least in part, about who gets to choose which parts of the shared history. And I included a graph here. You heard in the introduction that I was interested in data science. This comes from my data science analysis of OpenAlex, which is software that looks at what people are writing about, academics are writing about. And the line I want to draw your attention to here is this pink line, or this, I guess this is purple, right? This purple line. And the peak rising coming up in 2017. This line represents the importance of, or represents the number of academic publications concentrating on the Cossacks in Ukraine, or at least connecting to the word Ukraine. So the frequency of the term Ukraine in relation to the Cossacks. And what we see is that after 2017, it's pretty, it goes along until roughly about 2014. And then after 2014, takes this enormous spike, and the gradient there is much greater than in other cases. This is further analysis of the centrality of Cossacks to Ukrainian national identity. Again, is in my paper in Europe-Asia Studies, which will be coming out next year. And what it shows is that the importance of this is from 2004, so this is around the time of the Orange Revolution, and looking at just the number of articles that in the Ukrainian press versus the Russian press that mention the term Cossack in Ukrainian and Russian respectively. And what it shows is that actually the Orange Revolution was in November 2004, and so we saw that see that the salience of the Cossack image is actually increasing prior to the revolution, suggesting perhaps some interesting dynamics there. So how does the Cossack help us interpret current events? Well, it demonstrates that that there is a shared space, historical, ideological space between Russia and Ukraine. And then a possible rationale for the war, not one I agree with, I don't think this legitimizes war, but from the Russian point of view, this might be one of their rationales, is that Russian national identity cannot survive if its different ethnic groups privatized parts of that identity. The hypothesis here is that if the Ukrainians were to lay claim to the Cossack identity, then it would abrogate Russia's claims to the same. That it would somehow deny Russia's claims to have that, or to have that to be an integral part of Russian national identity. And so it follows that this is Russia's war and not just Putin's. And it's one that's based on a fundamentally different conception of the nation. That is to say, the repository of national myths and stories coming together, what Anthony Smith will call the mythomature of the nations. The mythomature coming together is meant for a single nation in the case of Ukraine, from the Ukrainian point of view, but in the case of the Russians, they want all these different parts to make up their mnogonacionalny narod, their multinational nation. And further, it's an expression of civic nationalism in Ukraine and an archetype of how some Ukrainians are volunteering. And I did already mention that some Ukrainian units have a Cossack motif. The image of the Cossack is very motivational to them. And when people from the West interview Ukrainian soldiers, you often hear the expression, "I am a Cossack," which means I have to go and defend my land. This is what I'm doing. So now let's move to Russia. And you can see the modern Russian Cossack movement here. This is actually from their main website, vsko.ru. And you can see the map of Russia divided into numerous Cossack regions, which correspond to the imperial boundaries and not necessarily modern day administrative units. And we have, from this picture, we have 12 Cossack regional voiska. A voiska is a word meaning army, but I think it's better translated as host because it holds on to some of the romantic attachments of the military. But we have 12 regional voiska which are united in a single overarching voiska, and that unification happened in 2018, which is quite an important date to talk about. So the 12 regional voiska are that are listed here are the Cuban Cossacks, the Krasnodar Cossacks, the Orenburg Cossacks, the Ussuriysky Cossacks who are in Siberia, the Don Cossacks who are in the region around Rostov. I'm losing track. I can't see the same. The Volga Cossacks who are in the region around Stalingrad, the Irkutsk Cossacks who are from Siberia as well. There is the Central Cossacks who are from the region around Moscow, and there are different groups. There's the Volga Cossacks, the Zabaykalsky Cossacks, the Chornomorsky Cossacks, who are the Black Sea Cossacks focused on Crimea, the Yenisei Cossacks, and the Siberian, and a lot of those groups are in Siberia. Now, important to this definition is that important to this map of Cossack groups is that there are two definitions of Cossack. There are those people who think that Cossack is an ethnic identity, that it's inherited from fathers to sons, or from mothers to daughters. And they're also known as free or public Cossacks, versus those who think it is a soslovie, that is to say, a military estate, which they're also known as the registered or service Cossacks. It's important to note that these 12 voiska refer, at least on the VSKO site, and there are voiska which correspond to the ethnic definition of Cossack, but these ones refer only to the registered Cossacks. And those troops I showed you earlier, the 30,000 troops who are fighting in Ukraine, those are just registered Cossacks. So they're all registered, at least at the moment. Now, the number of ethnic Cossacks is many times greater than those of the registered Cossacks. The registered Cossacks number 156,000, and there's some division between those who are too old and too young to fight. And so there's actually the number of military age is around 60,000. One thing I didn't address in this presentation, which I think is really important, is the fact that the Russian Cossacks are raising the next generation of youth to fight in Russia's future wars, and they have this series of groups called the Cossack Cadet Corps, where they take kids and they put them in these military academies for all of their schooling, and then train them up to be Cossacks to fight for the motherland in the future. There are an estimated 7 million ethnic Cossacks throughout Russia and the former Soviet space. As I said, there are 156,000 registered Cossacks. So the registered are divided into regional hosts. There is some evidence that the Russians have been expanding and building on the idea of these Cossack social structures as a way of consolidating and mobilizing society. The first piece of evidence that comes to that is that the number of hosts has increased. Before 2005, there were only 10. Since 2005, in 2007 they created the Central Cossacks, who are those around Moscow, and in 2015 they created the Black Sea Cossacks. At the end of last year, they created the Northwest Cossack host, which is actually not represented in this list of 12 groups you see up here, presumably because they haven't made the website yet for them. And they've created Cossack structures in Zaporozhye and Kherson, as well as in Luhansk. So we're seeing the creation of more Cossack structures. And in fact, this is one of the main ways, I would venture to speculate, one of the main ways in which the inhabitants of those areas are forced to fight against the country of their birth. The Northwest Cossacks are particularly worth watching because that's going to be the area around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. It's uniting those groups. Could be looked at as trying to present the image of an indigenous group whose rights are being violated in the future. Now, it is true that both registered and public Cossacks have been fighting in Ukraine. It is true that both Cossacks from the ethnic definition and from the registered definition have been fighting. I don't have numbers on the division of the split, but at least from the claims of the Cossacks themselves, there have been ethnic and free Cossack, ethnic and registered Cossack fighting. So, what are the roles played by the registered Cossacks? Well, they provide a source of troops and volunteers. And I should say that this creation of the All-Russian Cossack movement built on a number of innovations. In the 90s, there was a creation of Yeltsin created the Presidential Council for Cossack Affairs, and I think Putin turned it into the Committee for Cossack Affairs, and Putin's attempts to use the Cossacks really became entrenched after 2005 when the Orange Revolution sent shockwaves through Russia. But what are the roles played by the registered Cossacks? Well, they are a source of troops and volunteers, and that volunteer role is actually going to be quite important. I've already mentioned this, the creation of Cossack educational institutions and giving an ultra-patriotic upbringing for people from all over Russia. But it doesn't stop there. They also help with ecological catastrophes, for example. So they help put out forest fires and flooding when there are things that need doing. They're playing an ideological role. They are cast as being soldiers of the church. Now, historically, the Cossacks were not of one religion. Historically, there were Buddhist Cossacks, which sounds kind of oxymoronic to me, Islamic Cossacks, and even Jewish Cossacks. But the modern movement, the modern registered movement, is really trying to impress the Orthodox identity on them, which is possibly a result of the fact that Konstantin Malafeev, the Orthodox oligarch, is their sponsor and has been responsible for a lot of this movement. But they also provide security patrols, beginning in 1999 in Rostov and Krasnodar, which is down here, right by the Black Sea, right by the combat zone with Ukraine. There was beginning in 1999, there were initiated Cossack patrols or Druzhiny patrols, which went around Russian cities and arrested or detained hooligans, checked identity papers, that sort of thing. And in Krasnodar, they were actually responsible for harassment and physical violence against the minority Ahizka Turk population or Meskhetian Turk population, which in part led to their relocation from Krasnodar to the United States. About half of the movement or half of the group, so 10,000 people, were relocated from Krasnodar region to the United States. And these security patrols, they spread so this is a paper that's coming out with Problems of Post-Communism, but these security patrols, they spread throughout the Russian Federation, and the dots, the colors of the dots, indicate the different years in which patrols first were registered, first were recorded, helping to provide security in Russian cities. And now they're pretty much ubiquitous throughout Russia. Before the full-scale invasion, there were attempts to create Russian Cossack patrols in Kharkiv, and I think also in other cities like Sumy around the region. So there's this element of social security they provide. I've already discussed environmental security, where there's a real impetus on preventing forest fires and that sort of thing. And again, education here. The Cossacks playing a big role in teaching the next generation to fight, teaching the next generation to hate their enemies. They work with other groups like Rosmolodozh and Yunamia. They sometimes integrate with those groups, but they do maintain a separate role. So we have these Cossack Cadet Corps, and I thought it's quite interesting that their acronym in Russian is KKK, but they are referring specifically to this Cossack identity and not necessarily to a racist identity. And I do say not necessarily because there's good evidence that the two overlap. We have a number of Cossack schools, we have Cossack universities, we even now have a professional education institution for the Cossacks. And that is a future paper looking at the spread of Cossack educational institutions. I think the stat is that there's 156,000 children in Rostov alone, Rostov Oblast alone, who are in some form of Cossack education, Cossack-related education. And again, there are a number, there's 26 universities involved in this new League of Cossack Universities. So this is an idea which is on the ascendant. Again, another future paper is this idea of, is the war seeing a rebirth of the Russian Cossacks? Those websites I showed you before, I'm going to talk about the graphic first. Those websites that I showed you before, relating to the Cossack Vojska, all produce their own news articles, and the graph shows the number of articles produced by year. And what we can see, if you leave out the decline in 2024, because of course we're still in 2024, if you leave out the decline in 2024, we see just an explosion of Cossack articles and Cossack propaganda, in a sense, to ordinary Russian citizens. So the war seems to be uniting, the war seems to be propelling the movement of these Cossack organizations, at least measured by the number of articles they produce. It also seems to be uniting ethnic and service Cossacks. As Vodolatsky said, one of our main tasks now is to unite the Cossacks and to eliminate the artificial division that was introduced back in the 90s. Very quickly, that division to which he's referring, it came about with the introduction of the Cossack Register in 1995, and that was what really divided registered from ethnic Cossacks. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Similarly, another quote from Vitaly Kuznetsov, who is the ataman. And I do want you to know, earlier when I was talking about Ukrainian Cossacks, I talked about hetman. With the Russian Cossacks, the word is ataman. Obviously, they have a very similar etymology, but there's a little bit of difference there as well. And I think that really captures the difference between the two groups. Vitaly Kuznetsov said that I always said that on the front lines there are no registered and public. The priority is the unification of the Cossacks. Also, one of my hypotheses that I'm interested in exploring further in the paper is whether the rebirth of the Cossacks, because this growth of articles really began in 2018 and has continued from there. Whether this, and that was actually the point at which the All Russian Cossack Society was created, whether this rebirth made whether this foundation of such institutions made war thinkable. And what role did this play in creating the idea of war? Or was 2014 a better point for that? The final slide I want to address, given the interest of your centre, is this notion that there are Cossacks outside of Russia. That is to say, there are ethnic Cossacks who were chased out of Russia in 1919. So the Cossacks fought on the side of, most of the Cossacks fought on the side of the White armies, the Tsarist armies in the Russian Civil War. And in 1919, the Bolsheviks came through traditional Cossack lands and they said, we've got to eliminate the Cossacks. We've got to, I forget the exact phrase here, drive them out with merciless mass terror, I think is the phrase that's reported. And so the Cossacks left and they spread all throughout Europe. And from Europe, they went to other countries, including the United States. So now there are Cossack diaspora groups in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and in other countries, particularly of the former Soviet Union, certainly in Serbia, Germany, France, Finland, etc. They remember these events of the 1919 as genocide, and this here is the day of the genocide is the 24th of January, where it's called the genocide of the Cossack people. Some of these Cossack groups outside of Russia have played a role in agitating for Putin. The picture on the right that you see there is a guy called Simeon Boykov, who's in Australia and has got in trouble with the Australian authorities for pro-Putin protests in Canberra and other cities, calling himself the Aussie Cossack. He leads a group of Zabaikalsky Cossacks who are existing outside of Russia. I've also been contacted by journalists from Finland and Germany relating to Cossacks who are possibly causing trouble in their societies. And there is this organization called the Union of Cossack Warriors of Russia and Abroad, which coordinates, and the Orthodox Church also plays a coordinating role for Cossack groups outside of Russia. So this is perhaps something to keep an eye on, a vector of Russian influence that has so far been unappreciated. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all your slides and for explaining so much. We'll let people put questions in the chat and I'll look at those in a minute. But I wanted to kind of review a few things that you said, kind of just get you to elaborate a little bit. So you have written that the Cossacks play a role in Putin's Russia as volunteer soldiers.
Yeah.
So they're not mercenaries. They don't fight for money like the Wagner Group. So can you just elaborate a little bit on their motivation, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course it's hard. It's almost impossible to see what's truly in someone's heart. I will say that there is financial compensation for the Cossack groups. However, a lot of them claim, at least, to be doing it out of patriotic belonging and out of their duty as Cossack people, as having this as an inherent part of their identity as Cossacks. So yeah, I mean, and it's interesting to know that the Cossacks, and I've got quite a few articles on the Jamestown website, and you can see this in there. But the Cossacks are organized through the BARS system, which is the Army Reserve system in Russia, and they're getting a lot of their military equipment through the BARS system. So that's finding a lot of recruits there. One of the questions I'm interested in, but I have no idea how I get data on it, is the question of how many people are declaring themselves as Cossacks in order to join through the BARS system versus just, you know, being Cossacks already and deciding to join to sign up. That's difficult. That's a difficult question to adjudicate, however. But as far as motivations, you know, at least what they claim is that they're doing this because they're defending the motherland. And of course, it's always interesting. It's never about being aggressive to someone else. It's about defending the motherland. So,
yeah, right. We have a comment, and not a question, but a comment in the chat that says, what we saw of the Cossacks emerging in the late 1990s emphasized the ability to reclaim and display that identity. So it's in agreement, I think.
yeah.
Now, and I want to push you a little bit more on something else you mentioned, and sure. You have articles. You have articles about this, and then a couple coming out that you shared with me that explain a lot of what you've shared with us today. And those articles discuss the contemporary uses of historical Cossack archetypes in both Russia and Ukraine. And I'm wondering if you can just expand a little bit more on how your research on Cossacks helps us to think about whether this is Putin's war or Russia's war.
Yeah. The idea here is that, you know, this is a genuinely popular part of Russian identity, that Russians will inherently gravitate towards this idea that the Cossack is an integral part of their nation. And in fact, in the strange Russian taxonomy of ethnic groups, they consider the Cossacks to be a sub-ethnos, which is not a term that we really feel that comfortable with in the West, but in part because we have different priors about the nature of ethnicity. But they consider the Cossacks to be a sub-ethnos, to be a group that is inherently part of the Russian nation, and so you know, having a claim that another nation, i.e. Ukraine, is founded on Cossack identity. And one of the things I did want to mention is that when the Ukrainian state was first founded in 1919, the leader of that state was actually, at least he claimed, I think it was Pavel Skoropadsky. Skoropadsky actually claimed to be descended from the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and he was awarded the ceremonial title of Hetman of Ukraine. So, you know, this is not by any means a modern invention. This is something that has deep roots, and Sergei Plokhy at Harvard talks a lot about how the Cossacks were integral to Ukrainian nationalism in the 19th century. But having another group, having another nation claim as part of their culture something that is that the Russians see as inherently theirs, is kind of I'm going to use the term ontologically destabilizing, right? So it calls into question the fundamental assumptions of what it is and what Russian is and what it means to be a Russian. You know, when I was on my sabbatical, I interviewed a Ukrainian refugee who was actually living in Japan at the time, so we did the interview online, and she said foreigners are always really confused about two things: about whether borscht is Ukrainian or Russian, and about whether Cossacks are Ukrainian or Russian. And she said, well, of course, they're our history, they're Ukraine's history. And I found that very, very interesting and revealing, right? So this is kind of a contestation over a memory or a cultural legacy in some respects. And I think, you know, that is part of how we understand nationalism and national identity in the West. And I can think of this in terms of food. Like, we like to divide foods into particular neat boxes. We say this is Indian food, this is Bangladeshi, and like we make out like they're somehow really very different. But of course, food, like cultural memory, is trans-regional. It's not really neatly defined into a national box. So so those divisions are somewhat artificial.
Yeah, I can see that. I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, you mentioned that there are what you have in this slide that's up here, that there are Cossacks outside of Russia and even in the USA.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us a little bit about them? I mean, what form are they taking? Are they organized? Is this on anybody's radar besides yours, obviously?
Well, yeah, I mean, so first of all, the huge caveat here, which is that my source for most of this data is the internet, and the internet can have false things as well as factual things. But at least some of the reports I've seen are that so there is, first of all, there's Cossack history in the United States. The Cossacks were responsible for the expansion of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and they even came down to Fort Ross in California. You know, the Cossacks crossed the Bering Strait, and there's had some elements in Alaska. I believe they went down as far as Fort Ross. I'm not sure how long they stayed there, but they left after that. I have seen reports about Cossack training camps where there's paramilitary training out in Oregon and in Washington State. I don't know how true that is, but I've seen that. What is definitely true is that there were our Cossack emigre community, particularly in New Jersey. There's an area called New Kuban. There's a village or a town called New Kuban, and they have a Cossack heritage site where they preserve many of the relics. In 2010, Alexander Tkachov, who was the governor of Krasnodar province at that time, actually made a visit to Howell, New Jersey, to take back some of the relics and put them in the Krasnodar Museum, because the Bolsheviks had done such a great job of erasing Cossack memory from, or at least the physical remnants of Cossack memory. So the only memorial or memorabilia that they could take, or that they could have, was residing in these emigre community. That said, I've interacted several times with Cossack groups. I don't know if I've actually met the people in the USA. I've met the Canadian Cossacks, but I have interacted with some people leading this Cossacks USA movement. And then, just as in Russia and Ukraine, there are people who say, well, real Cossacks are Ukrainians and real Cossacks are Russians. There is also a Russian-Ukrainian split in Cossacks in the United States. So there are some who claim that they are, and again, I think they're mostly in New Jersey, but they claim that they are actually Cossacks who are aligned with Ukraine and they've sent help to Ukraine. And then there are Cossacks who claim that that they're aligned with Russia.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know how much credence to give the claims about paramilitary training groups, but they produce videos and they have, and they make that claim at least. But again, it's a question of verifying.
Right. So, future research for you.
Right.
Well, you also mentioned to me that you had been in Ukraine. You had been, was it 2019? I think you said you were in Ukraine.
2018 and 2019.
2019. What is your impression of the role of the Cossacks in Ukraine today? Are they playing a role fighting for Ukraine's freedom? They are.
So yeah, I mean, I think again, the Cossack it's mostly the Cossack image which is important, because you get into these definitional questions of what actually is a Cossack and who qualifies as a Cossack. There are some people who there's a guy called Taras Chukliv who says that a Ukrainian is a Cossack and a Cossack is a Ukrainian. I don't think most people would support that extreme position. But there's definitely Cossack symbolism on the front lines and in the military units. But there are Cossack training groups. You can read obituaries of soldiers who've died, who said, who said that they got their first training through Cossack camps. And when I was there in 2018 and 2019, I actually attended some of these Cossack paramilitary training camps where they were teaching kids, and they were young kids. So, I mean, it's hard to say that there's a direct influence on any kind of military proficiency, but they were teaching kids survival tactics. They were doing nature walks around the island of Portitsa with kids, and just sort of playing up the Cossack image and putting on this kind of WWE style fighting in the Zaporozhian Siege, and teaching children the basics of combat hopak, which is, as I understand it, it's a dance that the members of Cossack affiliation will say will perform, and where they use swords, and they're just twirling swords around and dancing at the same time. And I got treated to a very special demonstration by a young man of when I was in Zaporozhia in 2018. So there's definitely a very strong identity, and I do want to make the case that the Cossacks are primarily associated with Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk and Kherson and those areas, but it is a national identity, right? So I've talked to Cossacks from Lviv, I've talked to Cossacks from other parts of the country, really claiming that this Cossack identity is really important to them. So we have the training camps in 2014. The guy I've worked with the most, he's actually in his 50s, and I was very impressed that when the invasion broke out, he stepped up straight away to go and perform his military duties, which I thought was really emblematic of the morale of the Ukrainians. I mean, he's not a young man, and yet he's going forth into particularly dangerous situations. But he claims there was Operation Volunteer, Operation Watch, and all other sorts of operation during the 2014 protests. So again, really making the case that the Cossacks were there looking out for and defending Ukrainian sovereignty as they best saw themselves able. But in terms of an independent role for the Cossacks in the military, it's been very difficult to establish that.
Okay. And you mentioned you estimate there are approximately 30,000 on the Russian front fighting on behalf of Russia. Is that correct? It was the Russian front?
Including rotations. So
Yeah.
that's their number. That's the number they give. 29,500 was the most recent number I saw.
Okay. And you also mentioned that you're interested in a link between private military corporations, companies like Wagner type or convoy type companies, and the Russian Cossacks. And I'm wondering, do you have anything on that so far that you want to share with us, or anything you can say about that?
So yeah, I mean there's indications that many of the leading figures in Wagner, like this guy whose call sign is Mazai, I can't remember his name, but his call sign is Mazai. He had Cossack affiliations, and he got his training, got his origin really with some of these Cossack formations. The leader of convoy is a guy called Konstantin Pikolov, and Pikolov is actually a Black Sea Cossack. So he's from Crimea. He got his money from St. Petersburg. So it does appear that there's at least indications of overlap. And there's also discussion about creation of Cossack private military companies. I think Kadyrov has expressed, I could be wrong about this, but I think he's expressed an interest in creating a Cossack Oh, maybe he's interested in creating a private military company. But anyway, he likes the Cossacks.
That
So,
follows.
sorry?
That tracks.
Yeah,
That
right.
Kadyrov would appreciate the Cossacks. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a lot of overlap. One of the things I'm interested in doing this summer actually is in using facial recognition software to analyze people from to analyze Telegram messages and seeing if they're just the same people in the Telegram channels or the websites of the private military companies as the Cossacks themselves. That's something I think would be really interesting, and seeing also to what extent they talk to each other, to what extent there's communication between the two, and how often they use each other's tags and that sort of thing. So analyzing using Telegram. I'm at the moment I'm trying to get the algorithm to work, and I was doing this just an hour ago. I'm trying to use Tableau to look at references to private military companies in Cossack literature. So to what extent do the Cossacks talk about Wagner? And there's it's not zero, right? I mean, it's a fairly sizable number. So there's a lot of talk about Wagner. It becomes trickier with things like convoy, because convoy is a word that can have many meanings and not just the private military company, let alone sword, shield, and flame, and some of the other ones. So that's a TBD question, but it's certainly something interesting.
Yeah. And now, is the facial recognition research what you'll be doing this summer at the Kennan Institute?
I hope so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we look forward to seeing the results of that research. Yeah.
Yes, I look forward to it working. So.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that you wanted to round out or review or just sum up?
No, I mean, one thing I will say is that I am the only person I know of who is focusing on the modern Cossack movement, and I think it's something we should be paying attention to, if only for its potential uses, let alone the prospective uses in the future. But I do think that this is something that's going to be increasingly a feature of Putin's Russia, and possibly that whoever comes after him. They're going to be an increasingly important area of Russian society, and and so I want to encourage people to pay attention to them.
Right. You've written about the ongoing paramilitarization of Russian society.
I have, yeah.
And the Cossacks are a big part of that. So
they certainly are. They certainly are. And Russia, reports that I've received from a number of people in Jamestown, as well as sources in Europe, suggest that Russia is now just awash with guns. And it makes sense, right? 8 years or 10 years off next to a leaky war zone, it's it's pretty reasonable that there are so many guns in the country, and we've seen a lot of school shootings, and in fact, the Crocus City hall attacks were carried out primarily using firearms. So I think this is going to be something that's going to have ramifications, because one of the possible futures, no, I know means the only one, but one of the possible futures is that when Putin goes, there will be a big fight, basically, between all these private military companies that are being created, and are each going to be in the pay of a particular claimant to the throne. So
yeah, it could be very, very messy. Yes, indeed. Well, Dr. Arnold, we want to thank you for your time and your insights. Your research is fascinating, and we really look forward to seeing the results of your future work. Thank you for being with us today at the Brutecast.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to all the folks who joined us today in the chat. That's all we have for today, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.